I want to begin this morning by asking everybody a simple question. Who here, actually, before I ask that question, who here has kids? Because Kid Zone is going on this morning. It's going to be in the community room this week instead of the regular Kid Zone week, as we're still working on renovations there. So that's going to be in the community room this morning. All right. Now that we've asked that question, we're going to kick off by start kicking off with this other question: who here has ever been disappointed? Yeah, by the mumbles in the hands, I see that everyone has experienced disappointment at some point in their lives. Now, disappointment can happen for several reasons. Someone didn't follow through with something, or the experience just didn't follow through with what you were promised. See, this is a big one, as we're, especially nowadays, you see in modern day advertising and just how people talk with one another, the hyperbole, the extra emphasis we use. It's really hard to live up to the hype sometimes these days. Now, advertisements, they're always using these big words: extreme, we promise big surprises, big fun, it's going to be epic, it's going to be awesome. I have got a story. A friend of mine once used these exact words to describe a place to my friend and I as we were going to New Brunswick to visit. Before I went to school in New Brunswick, my friends and I decided, hey, let's make a road trip out east. So we did. A friend of mine has family in Woodstock, New Brunswick, not Woodstock, Ontario. I got that really confused when I first moved here and found out there was a Woodstock, Ontario. I was so used to the New Brunswick one. But so he has friends in Woodstock, New Brunswick. So we went out there, and he said, one thing we've got to stop at when we're doing the touristy thing, we have to stop at Magnetic Hill. Now, what he described Magnetic Hill as to us, he described it as a hill. He used the word hill is important here. That your car, you'd park at the bottom, put it in neutral, and gravity or some level of science would pull up the car and you'd go reverse up this hill. Now, he used the words of epic, awesome, exciting. So when I thought hill, that was epic, awesome, exciting, I didn't think of mountain, but I definitely thought we were getting like a decent sized hill with a decent slope, that it was kind of impressive that a car would get pulled up it. Now, he spent the entire trip hyping this up, and when it was finally tourism day and we finally went out and we did all the things, we saw the giant axe, we saw the giant lobsters, those were as advertised, those were pretty big into scale. But when we finally got to Magnetic Hill, what we did was we rolled up, and it was no more than, it was underwhelming. It was a small slope. Now, if we're being honest, it's still pretty impressive, the fact that it does what it says it does. Like, you do still get pulled up this slope, but I was advertised some hill. I was advertised more. I was expecting more. The way that this was built up to me was that this was going to be some big hill that we were going to get that the car was just going to get pulled up backwards. So my friend and I, who got this hyped up to us, were a little bit disappointed, a little bit underwhelmed by the expectation that was built up. Now, I had such high expectations at that point, I'll admit, that anything below what I was expecting was going to disappoint me. See, I look back on it and I do say, like, this is pretty impressive that it does pull your car backwards, even up a small slope. But in that moment, I had such high expectations that I missed the whole point of what was happening. I missed it. And all I could think of was, well, this is disappointing. This is what I wanted to see here. This morning, I want to be talking about hearing from God, and we're going to walk through the passage in 1 Kings chapter 19, 9 to 15. Now, before we walk in to this passage, I want to give you some context of what's happening. And we're going to meet the prophet Elijah when he's when he's reaching out to God, he's sought out after God because he's in a really dire state. See, he's the only prophet, the only person left following God in all of Israel. What was once God's people, God's nation, he's the one prophet remaining. He's the only one left, and the rulers of Israel are currently seeking after him to try to put him to death. So he's in a bit of a perilous spot, and I just want to quickly recap what gets him there before we pick up in 1 Kings 19. See, we see earlier what I like to call the battle of the prophets. Elijah is confronted by the prophets of Baal in the nation of Israel, and a challenge gets put out to try to determine who is the real God of Israel. Is it God, the God of Israel, the Father, the God of Jacob, or is it Baal? Now, at this point, like I said, he's the only prophet remaining, so it is him versus what is said to be about 450 prophets of Baal. So the challenge gets put out. We're both going to build an altar, and then we'll pray, we'll sacrifice, we'll worship our God, and whoever's God lights the bigger fire is obviously the true God of Israel. So, prophets of Baal go first. They build an altar, they bring their sacrifice, they pray, they worship, they do all the things that the prophets of Baal do, and after endless amount of time, nothing happens. Baal brings nothing. So Elijah says, okay, it's my turn. He does the same thing, except he adds one extra step, and I guarantee this step is not what you would say conducive to fire. He soaks his altar. He drenches it. No matter what we're doing by human efforts, we're not lighting this altar that Elijah has built. So if it's going to light on fire, it is going to have to be from God. So he now does his thing. He builds it. He brings his sacrifice. He worships. He prays. He asks God for fire. And in that moment, you get a massive amount of fire absolutely eradicating this altar. Pure proof of God's power and that he is the true God of Israel. Now, this event also then leads to the death of these other prophets of Baal. And as you can imagine, the rulers of Israel at the time who worshipped Baal and promoted that religion, they were not happy to find out that their God was beat in a one-on-one battle of the prophets, 450 battle of the prophets, and then those prophets were then put to death. So word gets to Elijah that, hey, you're the last one left, and you're about to be the last one ever, because we're going to come and you're going to die. So in that moment, even after seeing this big, miraculous display of power from God, Elijah runs. Elijah runs, and we're going to pick up with him in a mountain in Judah, in the neighboring nation of Judah, as he cries out to God, and as God notices where he's at. So we're going to pick up this first little bit. It's just going to be the first two verses. We're going to walk through this passage piece by piece. We're going to pick up in 1 Kings 19, verses 9 to 10. There he came to a cave and lodged in it. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him, and he said to him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He said, "I have been very jealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. For the people of Israel have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets. And I, even I only, am left, and they seek my life to take it away." See, we have what I call dueling perspectives here. We're going to look at what Elijah has to say first, even though he spoke second in these two verses. God asks him, "Why are you here?" And Elijah sees that as a face value question. Why? God wants to know why I am in this cave. What brought me here? So Elijah answers, "I'm the last one left. Everybody else has abandoned you. Everybody else is thrown into the ground. I am the only one still faithfully following you. And I am about to be the last one ever. They are going to put me to death. And so we see Elijah, he's worried, he's scared. But we also see through the context that he is used to God removing the burden. He is used to God appearing in these big, powerful ways. He has seen it time and time again. He knows that God can remove this burden from him. He knows that if these rulers are a legitimate threat to him and he comes to God, God can just remove them. Burden gone, trial gone, issue removed, and he can go back to being God's mouthpiece, the prophet of Israel, without having to worry about these two rulers in place. But I want to go back and I want to look at God's perspective. And we see that in just one line when the word of the Lord appears to Elijah. And it's just simply, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" Now Elijah takes that question at face value. What am I doing here? Well, God, I'm the last one. I'm here. I'm retreating from people trying to kill me. Help. But what God's really getting at here is God knows why Elijah is there. God knows that Elijah is scared. God knows that he's going to be put to death. God knows this. So his question of why are you here is not asking for an explanation to what brought him there physically, but God's perspective is that he knows that he's been providing for Elijah. He's been there. He's been doing this. So he's asking, Elijah, why did you run? Why did you, not what are you doing here, but why did you come here? Why did you come to this cave? What brought you here? Why are you running in fear? I've provided for you with power and miracles time and time and time again. What brings you here now? And you see in Elijah's response, he's essentially asking God for another miracle. He's saying, you've done it before, do it again. Provide another miraculous way out of this situation for me. So that's where we meet them initially in verses 9 to 10. We meet them where God is trying to ask Elijah why he ran, and Elijah is just trying to justify his actions to God. I was scared, they're going to kill me. I need you to perform another miracle. See, we have that expectation of God in our lives quite often. We know, as Christians, we know that God can move in powerful ways. We've heard stories, maybe we've seen it in our own lives, of God healing the sick, God taking away anxieties, God providing when there seems nowhere to turn. We've seen it in other people's lives. We've probably seen it in our own lives. We know that the expectation is that we can go to God and God will provide. We see these miracles happen. We hear these big stories of suddenly the money was there, suddenly the bone was healed, suddenly the addiction was gone. And those things happen, and they are so amazing when they do, because God is good. But my question to you this morning is, what happens when they don't? When we come with the expectation that God is going to provide the miraculous, it'll be suddenly healed, it'll be suddenly provided for, the addiction will suddenly be gone. What happens when it's not instant? When God doesn't provide that instant way out that we're looking for, that we're expecting, that we think God is going to do? What is our reaction when God doesn't instantly provide what we want in the way we want it to be? I would argue that oftentimes our reaction can be disappointment. We're disappointed that God didn't provide the way that we wanted to in our timing. And we sometimes forget that, well, all good things come from God. All good things also come on God's timing, in God's way, that we oftentimes will not understand in the moment. We continue in verse 11. We see God's response to Elijah. And he said, "Go out and stand on the mount before the Lord." And behold, the Lord passed by. And a great and strong wind tore the mountains and broke in pieces the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire. But the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, the sound of a low whisper. And then Elijah heard it. He wrapped his face in his cloak, and he went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. And behold, there came a voice to him and said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" That was verses 11 to 13. We see God's response is to tell Elijah, "Look, I'm going to appear for you again. Be prepared." And what he then does is he sends 3 acts of his power and might. Wind destroying mountains, earthquakes, huge fire, anything that if we saw that suddenly just happen, we would think that is God. But the scripture says very clearly, God was not in those 3 acts. He may have sent them, but he was not in those 3 acts. But instead, afterwards comes a low whisper, something more subtle, something definitely not. If we hear a whisper, most of us will turn around and think somebody's behind us. Something not nearly as miraculous and strong as those 3 initial acts. But in that moment, Elijah knew right away that one is God. And after this display, he uses that whisper and he asks Elijah once again, "What are you doing here?" You see, God in this display, he's trying to get a point to Elijah of, yes, I can do these big, powerful things. I can move in these big, mountain-moving, mountain-breaking ways. But you can't limit me to that. I understand you were the last prophet left. I understand that people want to kill you. I understand your situation. And I understand that I do have the power to lift that burden from you. And I understand that your expectation is that it's going to be in some big, miraculous way where the power is just removed. But there's another way. God can move in more than just the miraculous ways, and we can't limit him just to those ways. See, we follow along here. We pick up at chapter 13 and on. We're actually going to go to chapter 18, verses 13 to 18 here, or 14 to 18 here. And we're going to pick up again with Elijah's response to seeing God's display. He said, "I have been very jealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. For the people of Israel have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. And I, even I only, am left, and they seek my life to take it away." And the Lord said to him, "Go, return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus. And when you arrive, you shall anoint Hazael to be king over Syria. And Jehu, the son of Nimshi, you shall anoint to be king over Israel. And Elisha, the son of Shaphat and Abel-Meholah, you shall anoint to be the prophet in your place. And the one who escapes the sword of Hazael shall Jehu put to death, and the one who escapes the sword of Jehu shall Elisha put to death. Yet I will leave 7,000 in Israel, all the knees that have not bowed to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him." Elijah didn't get the point right away. God asks the question again, hoping that this display was going to be enough for Elijah to get what he was trying to say to him. But instead, Elijah responds with the exact same sentence, with the exact same reply. I'm the last one. I need help, God. Please lift this burden from me. So we see God draw it out a little bit clearer this time and give him instructions of what to do next. To go anoint the new king over Judea, over Syria and Israel. Go anoint the new kings. And you're complaining about being the last prophet left. Go anoint your successor. Go anoint the next one. These people will take the places of the current king, of the current kings, the oppressive force, and will supplement your position when you leave so that you will not be the last prophet. See, we see that God does relieve the worries and the stressors of Elijah here. He does relieve them, but he does it in a completely counterlogical to Elijah way. He expected this big show of force of God that he had just shown with the prophets. He had just shown the show of force, so he expected another one. This is what we think of your prophets, and this is what we think of the king and queen that are endorsing them. But instead, God goes what Elijah would see as the long way around. He says, no, we're going to do this another way. There's another story to be told here. So he says, go anoint these new people, have them be brought up. I am not removing your burden immediately. See, oftentimes when we get that sort of response from God, we don't recognize it at first. I'm not removing your burden immediately. We don't like to hear no, let alone from God when we're coming with a plea of a major need. We don't like to hear no, especially because we don't understand why not. In the moment, we don't understand what good could come out of the suffering that we're going through. Your heart may be broken because you or someone you really close to is fatally ill, and you're asking God time and time again, please remove this burden, please heal this person, please heal them. They love you so much. They are man or woman after your own heart. Why must they suffer like this? And an answer to this is given to us in the New Testament in the letter of James, chapter 1, verses 2 to 4. This is honestly one of my favorite verses in the scripture. It says, "Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds. For you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness, and let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing." God will not always act in the way that we expect him to. Burdens will not always be lifted off our shoulder right away. Why do good things happen? Why do bad things happen to good people? Because it was never promised that it wouldn't. In fact, those bad things, these trials, these sufferings, they are meant to strengthen our faith. They are meant to remind us that we can't get through these issues, these bad things on our own, but instead we need to rely on God. We need to trust God. We need to build our faith to the point where even when burdens aren't miraculously lifted off our shoulders, even when we're stuck in the suffering, we know that at the end there will be good. That God will turn all of our circumstances, no matter how bad they seem, to his good, according to his will. I want to encourage you all this morning that if you are going through a trial, a time of suffering, a time where you just don't feel like you can continue any longer, that you feel almost betrayed by God because this burden is still there, and who knows how long it may have been there for. Don't be disappointed that it's not lifted. Push past that temptation of disappointment. There are many people who God has let a burden sit for a little bit longer before it resolved in another way, that have lost their faith entirely because they just could not move past that feeling of disappointment. Because I can admit, it is fit when you ask for something and you feel like that is what you need, it can feel disappointing when you don't get an immediate response. But I can tell you, everybody who does hold fast in their faith, they have stories of how much better God's way was than just lifting it. How much they've developed as a Christ-like servant, how they've developed, how they've grown, how the people around them have grown, how situations have gotten better because their immediate response was not fulfilled. Have faith in God that no matter what the situation may hold, if you're in a situation like Elijah where you feel desperate, like there's only one way out, and you need God to fulfill that one way out, trust that God is bigger than your expectations. God is bigger than your perspective. You have a narrow, tunnel vision perspective at that point. You're seeing, this is my only way, this is my way out, I need God to provide it. But God has a much larger perspective than you can ever imagine. God sees the whole picture. In the story of Elijah that we saw, Elijah saw, I'm the last one left. If I die, there's nothing. But what God saw was how he's moved previously and how he can move beyond that point and how he's going to move. He knew that he was going to anoint Elijah. He knew he was going to anoint those kings. He knew what's going to happen beyond that point. All Elijah could see was that what happens next. He couldn't see beyond the struggle, the fear that was in front of him in that moment. So I encourage you all to turn towards God when we're in a time of struggle. I can invite the worship team back up now. Turn towards God in your times of struggle. Build up that faith. Seek joy in your trials and your suffering. Remember that even when things seem like they can't turn for the better, God will use them for his good. Now let us transition into a time of worshiping God and reflection on how he is a good God and all good things do come from him.